Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Kim Hecht, and I'm the Medical Director of Inpatient and Ambulatory Services at the Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute. Thank you so much for joining us during our community lecture tonight, Integrative Insider Live. Before we start, although I know we're all very used to virtual events, I want to review a few quick tips for the session. Please note we are recording this session. In this webinar, participants will remain on mute and hidden on the screen. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to send in questions as well as communicate with the event host throughout the presentation. We will hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and please clear all distractions around you. The Institute is very proud to provide this free community lecture. We have multiple clinics throughout Orange County. Our main clinic is located in Costa Mesa off of Bristol Street. We also have integrative services at other UCI health sites, including Newport Beach near Fashion Island, Pacific Medical Plaza in Costa Mesa, Yorba Linda, and recently we opened our newest location in Laguna Hills. Now on to the main event. Dr. Daniele Piomelli is a distinguished professor of anatomy and neurobiology, as well as the Lewis Turner Arnold Chair in Neurosciences at UC Irvine. He is co-director of UCI's Center for the Study of Cannabis and editor-in-chief of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. It is the only peer-reviewed journal dedicated to the study of cannabis, its derivatives, and their endogenous counterparts in the human body. Last spring, Dr. Piomelli received our Pilot Studies Award designated to support exceptionally innovative research projects that provide an understanding of the mechanistic basis or clinical outcomes related to integrative health therapies. Dr. Piomelli will be studying the prevention of chronic pain by activating metabolism with medical foods. He is a very prolific researcher and author of more than 400 peer-reviewed articles in journals such as Nature Science, Nature Medicine, PNAS, and Nature Neuroscience. He's also written 3 full-length books and has 34 patents. We are so very lucky to have you today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniele Piomelli to this evening's Integrative Insider Live.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hecht, for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I'm joining you from my office here in the medical school, and I will not be talking about the very exciting project that Dr. Hecht mentioned in her kind introduction. That hopefully will be the topic of some other presentation soon enough when we have enough interesting data to share with the public. But today I was tasked with a different objective to introduce all of you to the topic of cannabis and pain. And I entitled my presentation Cannabis and Pain, a Primer. I will go over some properties of cannabis, of the endogenous system that cannabis impinges upon, and I will also briefly talk about cannabis and pain, but I'll leave hopefully some time for questions specifically directed to the issue of pain. So I like always to start with a little bit of history. We are not new to cannabis as a species. Humans have used cannabis for 11,000 years, but I don't want to go that back in the past. I'll just like to tell you that we did not discover cannabis in the 1960s, as some of you might think. In fact, we've been studying it since the mid-19th century. 1845 is the date of the publication of a wonderful book by French psychiatrist Moreau de Tours, who introduced cannabis to modern science, along with soon thereafter scientists in the rest of Europe. And the work that Tours and other did introduce cannabis to therapy. And in fact, in the 1850s, cannabis was part of the so-called pharmacopoeias, which are the volumes that include pretty much everything that is used in a pharmacy, in a medical office. In the United States has one, it's called USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia. Every country has one. And cannabis was listed in the USPs of Europe and United States as a painkiller or analgesic, and as an antispasmodic, as well as with other potential indications. Now, everything was pretty good until the 1930s, when in 1937, a piece of legislation was introduced in the United States, and similar legislation was introduced elsewhere in the world. And our own was called the Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively made cannabis illegal. I would like to point out that this piece of legislation was not caused by anything happening in the medical world. There was no sign that cannabis was especially dangerous or especially problematic. But it was linked to a political landscape where especially immigrants coming from Mexico were frowned upon, and often these immigrants would bring cannabis or marijuana was their recreation of choice instead of alcohol. And as a result of that, created an anti-marijuana sentiment in part of the population that was also fueled by a media campaign. But anyway, so that's a topic for a very interesting but different conversation. The problem is that when you make something illegal, it's very hard to study it. It is actually not that hard to find it, because if you are motivated enough, you can always find something in the black market. But if you're a scientist, of course, you cannot study things that are illegal. It's just simply impossible. So that slowed down really our understanding of cannabis as a medicine, and also our understanding of the risks associated with cannabis use. Now, this said, scientists tend to be kind of hard-headed folks. And so eventually, between 1944 and 1964, they were able to identify in the cannabis flower, which you can see right here, this beautiful structure, they were able to identify this chemical called tetrahydrocannabinol. It's a mouthful. We all call it THC for short, which is effectively responsible for the intoxicating properties of cannabis. So the high, the feeling of being stoned are due to this molecule, THC. So it took about 20 years to discover THC, and it took another 20 to make a step forward, even more than 20 to make another step forward, because yet another piece of legislation was introduced which strengthened the legal nature of cannabis, and that's the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. As I said, more than 20 years passed before we could understand how THC works. And in fact, this is something I will briefly talk about in a few minutes, is the discovery of the so-called cannabinoid receptors. And these are proteins present on the surface of cells, not just in the brain, but also elsewhere in the body. And these proteins bind the THC like a key binds into the lock in a door. And they're responsible for the effect of THC. So if you have no cannabinoid receptors, you have no effects of THC. So why do we have cannabinoid receptors? That's an interesting question that all scientists started asking themselves when the cannabinoid receptor was identified. And to make a long story short, a few years later, we were able to discover that we make our own cannabis-like compounds, our marijuana-like compounds, if you like, not just in the brain, but also elsewhere in the body. And to these compounds, we gave the name endocannabinoids. So the endocannabinoid system is this system of signaling molecules that are similar to THC and activate cannabinoid receptors. And we will say a few things about the roles of these interesting, fascinating molecules. So now here we are, it's 2021, and now the use of cannabis is legal as a medicine in 31 states of the Union and the District of Columbia. It's also in 18 states is legal as a recreational, non-medical substance. And because of this long history of illegality, we are in a situation where we have so many questions that we would like to be able to answer. And we simply don't have the data to answer them. So hopefully something will happen in the legislation in the near future to allow us to do those studies. Because right now, the fact that cannabis is illegal at the federal level makes it extremely hard, if not impossible, to study in research labs. extremely hard, not impossible, but extremely hard. So this said, we know a lot about THC, we know a lot about cannabis, and we can answer the question how cannabis works. So, and by that, I mean, how does cannabis produce its intoxicating effects, right? But also, how does cannabis produce its potential medical effects? Well, how does cannabis cause potential side effects? And we know that, I told you, because the chemical component of cannabis that is responsible for those actions is shown here in this chemical structure. It's called THC, or a fancy name is delta-9 THC. And what this compound does, I told you, is it really goes into the brain and elsewhere in the body, binds to these proteins present on the surface of cells called the cannabinoid receptors. And what you see here in this part of the slide is actually a real distribution of cannabinoid receptors in the brain of a person. This is a view, of course, as you can see, a side view or parasagittal view of the brain of a man. And where you see these more or less intense yellows and oranges. I don't know how good this is on your screens, but the more orange and the redder is, the more cannabinoid receptor is present. So in fact, we have two cannabinoid receptors. You will excuse me if I go a little bit into some kind of molecular detail, but I think it's important. We have two cannabinoid receptors. One is called CB1 and the other is called CB2. They are present all over the body. It doesn't matter really. I don't want to go too much into technical details, but they're present all over the body. They're present in the brain. They're present in the peripheral neurons, which are important in pain perception. They are even present in the liver and in our fat, which is something that I'm sure many of you found surprising, as I found it surprising when we discovered this many years ago. And the reason why it's surprising, of course, when you think about cannabis, you think about the brain, right? But in fact, we have the endocannabinoid system all over our body. So every time someone consumes cannabis, that person has cannabinoid receptors activated everywhere, in liver, just as in the brain. So what do these receptors do? We know now, in distilling down really more than 20 years, actually closer to 30 years of research done by many labs, including our own. And what we can say with almost certainty, I would say, us scientists tend to be, we don't like to say something for sure, right? We try to hedge our bets because we know that things change with time. But we know, I think, with reasonable certainty, the CB1 receptors, so these guys here, which are very abundant in the brain, are involved in the control of stress. So they help us cope with psychological stress. But also they're important in the control of pain and in the control of energy balance. What is energy balance? Energy balance is, at the end of the day, what happens when you eat and walk or eat and breathe. So the balance between the calories ingested and the calories consumed, that is the energy balance. And believe it or not, I know this may be a surprise to many of you, but believe it or not, actually the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoid receptors are really important in regulating that. So what about the CB2 receptor? That's a little bit of a mystery, but the CB2 receptor is very important in immunity, and it's also important in pain. So let's take a look at where the CB1 receptor, which is the one most abundant in the brain, is present in the human brain. And I use this sort of scheme here to make it a little bit simpler. I mean, I don't expect you to know what the structures are. The brain is a really complicated place. But I wanted you to focus only first on the color scheme here. You can see that this purple, I hope you see purple as I see purple here. This purple is the denser the color, the higher the density of the more intense the color, the higher the density of cannabinoid receptors. So for example, in this structure here, which is called the cerebellum, we have a ton of CB1 receptors. And here in the cortical mantle, we have less. Now, obviously you haven't seen these things many times, but those of us who do this for a living, neuroscientists, neuropharmacologists such as myself, look at this and marvel. We think, how the heck there is so much CB1 in the brain? There is more CB1 cannabinoid receptor in the human brain than almost any other receptor. And what is most striking is that it's present in very important parts of the brain. The cortical mantle, as you know, is where a lot of our thinking happens. So the cannabinoid receptors seem to be localized pretty much everywhere, except some areas. And they're interesting too. For example, if you look at this little guy here, this little nucleus, as we call it here, is called the Pre-Betzinger complex, which is a kind of a fancy name, but it's actually a funny story behind it, but I won't go there today. And in this complex here, we don't have a whole lot of CB1 receptors, so who cares? Why do we care about that? Because actually this little piece of our brain, which is at the very bottom of the brain, this little piece of our brain is important in the control of breathing. We don't think about breathing, right? You know, we can stop breathing, but normally, or intensify breathing willingly, but most of the times we breathe without thinking about it. And that's thanks to this guy here, the Pre-Betzinger complex, because there are neurons there, neural cells that have a pattern. They go like pump, 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 pump every time that we need to breathe. So now these neurons have a lot of receptors for morphine, for opioids, for heroin. They have a lot of those receptors, and those receptors stop the activity of these neurons. So that's one reason why, actually it's the primary, if not the only reason why heroin, for example, or now the infamous fentanyl, which some of you might have heard about, this opioid that kills so many people. This is how it works. It kills so many people because it stops their breathing. And it does so because it binds to neurons in this little part of the brain stem called the Pre-Betzinger complex. Fentanyl opioids caused 50,000 deaths last year, 50,000 deaths. And the vast majority of them are due to this particular thing. So what is interesting is that there are no CB1 receptors there, very, very few. And that's one reason why cannabis doesn't kill people. It's impossible to, if you hate someone or you're thinking about, you know, the plot of a detective novel, don't use cannabis to kill anyone because they won't be believable. It doesn't mean that cannabis is totally safe. It is not, but at least it won't kill you right away. So there are cannabinoid receptors all over the body. I already told you in this little scheme, I like to emphasize this same concept. You can see it all over the place, in places that you do not expect. For example, the lungs. What is it doing in the lungs? Well, it's controlling bronchial reactivity. There are actually drugs in the work on the endocannabinoid system. They are now being developed for cough, for example, but it's also present in the intestine, both small and large, in peripheral nerve terminals, in the kidney, in the immune system, in blood vessels. So again, what I want to emphasize tonight with you is that the use of cannabis does not only affect the brain, it can affect other parts of your body, and you have to be mindful of that. So, as I told you before, when we have a receptor in the brain or elsewhere that binds to a compound coming from a plant, as this is the case here, THC comes from the cannabis plant. When we have this situation, we always ask ourselves, why? I mean, it's not that we co-evolved with the cannabis plant. You know, we have known it for many thousands of years, for 11,000 years, but that's not enough to create, for evolution, to create a cannabinoid receptor in our brain. So why do we have the cannabinoid receptor? And the reason why we have the cannabinoid receptor is because we have our own cannabis-like molecules. So I don't want to lie to you, they don't look like THC at all. They actually are very different. If you look them on paper, even if you have a PhD in chemistry, even if you don't have, a PhD in chemistry, you tell right away, oh, wait, they are completely different. And they are completely different on paper, but they somehow in space are similar enough that they will combine with the same cannabinoid receptors that recognize delta-9 THC. So these endocannabinoids are something I've spent the last 30 years working on. It's a fascinating class of molecules. And one reason why they're fascinating is that they're completely different from any other transmitter in the brain, completely different. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go over that with you tonight, but because I could spend easily 5 hours talking about them. But what I want to impress on you tonight is that they are important in the control of all these different functions that are listed here. They're very important in feeding, and some of you may think, well, duh, what you know about the munchies, right? So you expect that, and that is actually would be smart, because that's exactly what it is. It's basically the control of feeding is kind of hijacked by smoked cannabis in the phenomenon called the munchies, right? They also control emotion. And a lot of people, for example, who use cannabis sort of semi-medically, go back home at night, after a long day, maybe a stressful day, instead of drinking, maybe a shot of whiskey, they smoke a joint, and that relaxes them. So again, we can go over whether that is a wise thing to do or not, but that reflects the fact that cannabinoid receptors and the endocannabinoid system are really important in the control of emotion. Pain, which is the topic of some of today's talk presentation, pain is very, very, very much controlled by the endocannabinoid system, although in humans not as much apparently as in laboratory animals. Cognition, which means learning and memory, also are the endocannabinoids play critical roles there. And reward, what is reward? The feeling of being satisfied, the feeling that you have done something good. That is something that, or something that is good for you. That is reward, and the endocannabinoids are very important in that. So if you think that these compounds are like pretty much present everywhere and do pretty much everything, I think you're quite right. You're very close to the truth. They are ubiquitous, as we say, and they're very pervasive in their action. It is one of the most important signaling systems that's been discovered in the last several decades. So, but I would like to go over the health effects of cannabis. I don't want to spend time on the endocannabinoid system, although, as I said, that's my favorite topic. But I'd like to talk about some other work that I've done with many other folks. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine created a committee to study the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids back in 2016. The committee met for 6 months. We were 16 members of this committee, assisted by NASM staff. And what we did, we reviewed about 24,000 papers from 1999 to 2016. So that wasn't really easy, but we did focus on so-called systematic reviews, which is a fancy name for saying, a digest of the literature. And at the end of the day, we produced a 468 pages report with 15 conclusions and 4 recommendations. So I'm not going to even attempt to summarize that. It is available online for those of you who are, into this kind of stuff. You can go to the National Academy site and you can download it. But I would like to give you a sense of what that report said. In particular, I want to focus on the therapeutic effects first and some of the potential health effects or side effects second. So the therapeutic effects, there is a hierarchy of evidence. Okay, so again, scientists tend to be very picky when it comes to stuff like this. Evidence for us is a very important thing. It's not the same as in a legal context. Evidence for us means something very specific. And to us, conclusive evidence means that we are sure. Unless something strange happens, we're sure of something. So we have conclusive evidence that cannabis and the cannabinoids, which is compounds like THC, are effective in chemotherapy-induced nausea. You can see right here. What is this? Well, that's the nausea, the sense of disgust that you have when you are a cancer patient and you take chemotherapy medications. You're part of it. You receive a chemotherapy regimen to treat your cancer. That almost inevitably causes nausea, as well as sort of a tingling of your hands. It's called something called paresthesias and allodynia. And there is conclusive evidence actually that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective at blocking that. And in fact, a lot of people, I'm sure some of you know of people, maybe even some of you have had this experience. I know recently a good friend of mine who I'm very thankful. He fought successfully with colon cancer. Actually, he completely annihilated the cancer. But during the chemotherapy, he had bouts of nausea. he managed them with other drugs, but a lot of folks actually manage them with cannabis quite effectively. There is also a cannabis derivative called marinol, which is basically a form of synthetic THC, which can be also found obtained by prescription, but it doesn't work as well. Everyone knows that. It doesn't work as well as actually inhaled cannabis for a variety of pharmaceutical reasons, the distribution, the time of action, etc. So chemotherapy-induced nausea, but, and this is the topic that I think some of you are interested in tonight, is chronic pain in adults. And there is what we define substantial evidence. So substantial is exactly what the word says. There is a lot of it. It's not conclusive. We would like to do a few more studies. If this was a little bit easier, it would be great to move the needle from substantial to conclusive. And most importantly, to understand things such as what kind of a dose do we need, and what kind of a dose range we need, what type of exact chronic pain conditions are sensitive and what are not. Unfortunately, as I said before, we are in a bad place because of the difficulties posed, created by the federal legislation. Also, there is substantial evidence of effectiveness in spasticity in MS. And that's actually really interesting because clinical trials have been done with a drug that is available in Canada and Europe, and is not available in the United States, which is called Sativex, which is nothing but an extract of cannabis. It's developed by a British company, which was now recently acquired by another company. But so this Sativex is a form of cannabis that is sprayed on the tongue, and it's been tested in patients with multiple sclerosis and who suffer from spasticity and pain associated. And by and large, patients tolerated the compound very well, the drug very well, and also felt that their life was better when they used this particular drug. So that's Sativex. Unfortunately, we don't have it in the United States. We only have it in Canada. So now we go from up, conclusive and substantial, to down, moderate. So moderate evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence, but the evidence is not good enough for us to be really convinced. And the moderate evidence of effectiveness are in the conditions such as sleep apnea and sleep disturbances associated with pain conditions such as fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and MS. A lot of people actually don't go to the doctor at all. We know this anecdotally, internet sources mostly, use cannabis for sleep disturbances. Now, that is a very interesting topic for another talk, but certainly if you have a good night of sleep with nice dreams and you wake up rested, almost everything else is better in your life. So that's something that really is worth further exploration. Now, we have, on the other hand, limited evidence of effectiveness in a variety of situations where you hear and you see on the internet, for example, that people use cannabis for, particularly PTSD. A lot of our veterans come back home and they have PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a very nasty, nasty condition. The vast majority of them uses cannabis. Why do they use it? Do they use it because it's effective? Do they use it for some other reason? Is it a placebo effect? We do not know. We don't have a placebo-controlled trial, so a trial with the appropriate controls to be able to say, okay, the reason why the PTSD patient is using this drug is because it's making feel them better, not for some other different explanation. So that's another area where we need more work. On the other hand, we have insufficient evidence to support or refute effectiveness in all these different conditions. And I want to highlight cancer because that's something that I've been personally involved with. Again, some time ago, a colleague of mine came into my office and said, I have this particular form of cancer. I don't want to use chemotherapy. I want to use cannabis. Can you help me? That person put me in a very difficult spot because there is no evidence to support a role for cannabis in treating cancer. Yeah, when a cancer patient may be undergoing chemotherapy can have benefit from or can benefit from moderate use of cannabis because it reduces the pain, it reduces the nausea, maybe it stimulates appetite, maybe makes them sleep better. These are all very important things. But there is no evidence at all, either for or against the effectiveness in the cancer. So whenever you see online that cannabis kills cancer, etc., is all extrapolations from a few animal experiments, well-conducted animal experiments, but they are typically done in either in cells in vitro, so in test tubes, or in animals, in mice typically. And for a variety of reasons, those experiments do not tell us what's happening in people. Now, I will skip over this and go on to one other important point, because some of you may wonder, oh, right, so the great state of California, we are the first in the country to legalize cannabis for medical use, at least, as I said, legally, but then, it was hard to get, but still it was legal to use as a medicine. And so we should know a lot about this, right? Well, no, unfortunately, we don't. In fact, the state creates a lot of confusion because when they define the qualifying conditions for cannabis use in California, which are listed here, is a big list of them, you can see that pretty much everything is included. If you read this last paragraph, which is taken from the state of California document here, it says any chronic condition, medical symptom that substantially limits the ability of a person to conduct one or more major life activities. So basically everything. However, the scientific data are only on these two particular conditions. So we have a disconnect between what the state is telling us and what science is telling us. Now, this is essentially due, and look, cancer is top of the list. This is very dangerous, and especially due to the fact that sometimes well-intentioned folks go to their legislator and say, oh, my son has got cancer, my daughter is anorexic. I know that cannabis works for whatever reason. You got to do something about it. And of course, the state representative goes and puts a piece of legislation that is very little better than just pure bogus stuff. Anyway, I wanted to inform you on that. And then I'll want to briefly go over some of the risks. There's a long list of things that we analyzed as a panel. All these things here, I want to reassure you right away, there is nothing you should worry about. Maybe one or two things, but not major things. I want to focus on cancer first, because that's a place where I think a lot of people worry, especially if one were to smoke cannabis. As you know very, very, very well, the smoke of tobacco products can cause cancer. It's not associated with, is not accompanied by, causes cancer. This has been established by decades of research, hundreds of thousands of papers. And decades of research and tens of thousands of papers have been able to find any effect of cannabis smoke on lung cancer and head and neck cancer. And there is, in fact, moderate evidence of no association, which is the opposite. Almost as if when you smoke cannabis, you have a lesser chance of developing a lung cancer. And a lot of people are really, really surprised by this. And I think that we cannot say that the final word is out, so more work is always welcome, because we could find something new. However, this puts at least me in a situation where I think, okay, this is not something we as a society should worry too much about for now. Other form of cancers, really nothing. The only form of cancer where there is what looks like an association is in testicular cancer. And this is something that is limited, but of course it's of concern for young men especially in their late teens and early 20s, because that's where the testicular cancer typically happens. And they also tend to be the folks who use cannabis. So I want to talk about the cardiac and metabolic risk. This is really important if you're interested in using cannabis for pain conditions, right? Because if one has a pre-existing cardiac or metabolic risk, that person wants to know, of course, if it's risky or not to use cannabis. So let me tell you, first of all, that there is and there's been shown an association between cannabis smoking and triggering and a myocardial infarction, okay? This means that if someone has a pre-existing condition that makes that person vulnerable, susceptible of a myocardial infarction, the smoking can trigger that. But we don't know if it's due to the act of smoking, which could be smoking a cigar, or the fact that it's a cannabis joint that is being smoked. So it's a little bit of a complex situation there, but there is this association. So it needs to be kept in mind. But on the other hand, the chronic use of cannabis is not associated, there's no evidence to show there is an association with myocardial infarction. There is limited evidence of association between cannabis use and ischemic stroke. That's also something to keep in mind, but clearly more work is needed. And here is a piece that I find especially fascinating, is that if you're obese, so if you're overweight above a BMI of 35, so that's morbidly obese, or you are diabetic, in fact, the chronic use of cannabis appears to be associated with a better outcome. So folks who use cannabis chronically typically have a lower body mass index, which is a measure of obesity, and they tend to have a lesser tendency to develop diabetes. So there are deep reasons for this. I don't want to go into them, but it's another piece of quote unquote good news, although we cannot be sure 100% that it's 100% good. Here is one thing that I always bring up because I think it's important, especially for young women who want to have kids or have children or about to, whatever scenario possible. So there is evidence of a statistical association between maternal cannabis smoking and lower birth weight in offspring. That has been shown. However, this is again smoking. So when someone smokes, someone takes in carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So you're basically making your fetus, your body and your fetus giving less oxygen to your body and your fetus. As a result of that, that is probably the reason for this. We so far have no proof that that maternal cannabis use has negative outcomes in the offspring. There was a recent paper, literally a couple of weeks ago, published in PNAS, suggesting such a link between maternal cannabis smoking and an anxious phenotype in young kids. However, there are certain issues with that paper. So before we start being worried about it, well, we should always be worried about these things, but before we panic about it, we should definitely take a little bit more time and get more data. There are a lot of complexity studying the problem because, of course, because animal models don't help, unfortunately. There are a ton of animal data on exposure to cannabis causing all sort of nasty effects in the animals, in the offspring of the animal. The problem is that the way we humans have a baby and the way an animal has a puppy are completely different. The placenta, structure of the placenta is different. The fetal barrier, blood barrier blood fetal barrier is different. And those are critical things. So these are difficult things to study. And I think more research is needed. Meanwhile, what I recommend people is, okay, if you can avoid it, try not to smoke, which I think everyone can. Try not to smoke during pregnancy. A lot of young moms do that because an increasing number of mothers do that because of the anti-nausea effect of cannabis, and they feel it's a natural product. Okay, don't be fooled by the fact that it's a plant. I mean, plants can kill you. In fact, the objective of many plants is to kill anyone who gets close to them and tries to eat them. So don't think that because it's natural, it's necessarily good for you. I don't think cannabis will kill you. I don't think it's going to kill your baby. But I think, if you want to have a healthy baby, the best thing is to stay out of all this, including alcohol, beer, wine, and everything else. So Mental disorders, some of you, I'm sure have heard that if I use cannabis, I'm going to go crazy. No, you're not. You're not going to go crazy. Neither are your kids going to go crazy. But there is evidence of an association with the development of schizophrenia. However, when we wrote this report 2 years ago, 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago, we had to write the substantial evidence of association with the development of schizophrenia, which is a form of psychosis, of course, is pretty prevalent. But we did not have the smoking gun. Now there is a smoking gun out there suggesting that this is not true, that there is no evidence of association with the development of schizophrenia. So if this is confusing you, it's not because I'm being confusing, it's because the situation is confusing. Unfortunately, we do not know enough. Again, my suggestion is stay safe, better safe than sorry, because this link with schizophrenia is mainly connected to use of cannabis early in life. So during adolescence, my strong recommendation to kids, yesterday I gave, for example, a similar talk to high school students in New York. My recommendation to them is, look, if you can avoid it until you get 25, avoid it. 25 is a magical number because at 25, our frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex in the brain stops developing. So at that point, we can actually indulge a little bit more in this type of psychoactive substances. But before 25, try to be careful, treat cannabis with respect. The other stuff, excuse me, stuff, depression, suicide, hold on. Suicide, social anxiety, there is stuff out there, but really not a smoking gun and nothing that at this point we should be too concerned about. So one thing, and with this I'm about to close, I want to finish a little bit earlier so that we can have more questions. One thing that many people ask me, and I think it's important to discuss, is what do we know about cannabis dependence? So let me say a few words about this word dependence. I like to define the words that I use because sometimes a lot of confusion and anger can come out of talking about things without defining the words that you're using. So what is dependence? Dependence, just like the word indicates, the term to depend on something. So if you're taking a drug and you need the particular drug for your normal functioning, your normal operation, you are dependent on that drug. Okay, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, it depends. For example, if someone is hypertense, so it has high blood pressure, right? And they're taking a blood pressure medication, they become dependent on that. And they become dependent because if they stop the treatment suddenly, what can happen, doesn't necessarily happen, well, what can happen is that the blood pressure can shoot up very, very quickly, even with very dangerous effects. So that is because the body has become used to having this drug in it, and so it has adapted in different ways. And pretty much all drugs do that to us, some more than others. Per se, dependence is not necessarily a bad thing if we can live with it. If I can every day take my dose of anti-hypertensive drugs, my blood pressure drug, if I can take that every day, well, I'm okay. Okay, of course, the problem starts if, the pharmacy explodes or we are in a zombie apocalypse and I no longer have my drug. In that case, I'm, out of luck, as they say. But in the normal world, we can usually live with some level of dependence. We're all dependent on something. I mean, if I wake up and I don't have my coffee, I'm pretty grumpy. So these are all things that we need to evaluate. Addiction is something a little bit different. They are connected, dependence and addiction, but they're not the same. Addiction it means craving, but also addiction means that not only you have cravings, but you also actually can mess up your entire life. Your entire life revolves around this drug or this particular behavior. You can be addicted to sex, you can be addicted to gambling, You can be addicted to shopping. These are all well-known and psychologically defined forms of addiction. And of course, you can be addicted to drugs. The opioid epidemics is a textbook case of drug addiction. If you are addicted to an opioid, like fentanyl, your life revolves around the use of fentanyl. You spend your days using it, trying to get money to buy it, and trying to avoid anything else. So your family goes down the tube, your friends go down the tube, your job goes down the tube. All those things change in your life if you are a person who is addicted to a strong addictive drug like fentanyl. Addictive drugs are many. There are quite a few, not many, there are quite a few. The worst probably of them all is, guess what? Nicotine in tobacco. So that's number one nasty thing. But there are also other nasty things. For example, alcohol is quite addictive as well, but I think can be managed more easily, in my opinion. Other things like the opioids are quite addictive. And yes, basically, at the end of the day, you first become dependent and then you become addicted. So there is a connection there. So what about cannabis? So frequent use of cannabis can result in dependence and loss of control over use, which means basically loss of control means that not only you are dependent, as I said before, but now you can no longer say, oh, okay, I'm going to do without this today. Okay, or going to do this, I'm going to only use it once a week or something like that. So if there is this loss of control, you probably have an issue, what we call a cannabis use disorder. And of course, if you suddenly have to stop, let's say that you want to clean up, and you say, okay, I've been taking cannabis every day for 3 months now, I'm going to clean up, and you stop cold turkey, you typically have a withdrawal response, which is quite annoying. It's not as bad as the withdrawal that occurs with opioids that can kill you. Cannabis withdrawal, to the best of my knowledge, does not kill you, but it does cause, loss of appetite, loss of sleep, irritability, all these sort of things. So this is what we call cannabis use disorder in technical terms. As I said, cannabis withdrawal is not a joke, but it's less serious than opiate withdrawal, and that means that it doesn't kill you. Now, this said, cannabis can cause acute toxicity, and there are certain forms of toxicity that have been described. You need to take a whole lot of it, and all of a sudden, I tell the story of a very large friend of mine. I was in a party down in San Diego, and this fellow is a giant. He's like 6 feet tall, and he's about 400 pounds, a very substantial man. And we were in San Diego at a party, and he never had cannabis. He said, "I want to try it." Okay, sure, go ahead, try it. He took this joint and smoked in one puff half of the joint, and he sat down on a chair and became white as a sheet of paper, as a ghost, and didn't speak for half an hour. And I was so scared for him because he's such a big guy, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't take him anywhere. So I sat down close to him and waited for him to be better. And that's the kind of stuff that happens, especially if one is not used to cannabis. I say you have to treat this thing with respect. It's not a joke. It's not something that you would never drink a whole bottle of whiskey in a sitting. Why would you smoke a whole joint or more, or have four brownies in one sitting? You don't want to do that. So you want to treat these things with respect always. If you want to test it, even for recreational purposes, but also most importantly for medical purposes, you need to start low and go up slow, and don't exceed, and control yourself. Try to keep control over your behavior. With that, I am going to stop. I think I left enough time for a couple of questions. I'll be happy to answer them if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Piomelli, for that informative lecture. I learned quite a bit about the areas of the brain that, the cannabinoid receptors attach to and throughout the body. So that was amazing. We have one question right now. Does cannabis also have a side effect of itching similar to opioids? In other words, would this be a good alternative for pain management for individuals who have itching with opioids?
Fantastic question. No, cannabis does not cause itching because the opioids cause itching through a mechanism that is really kind of weird and unique to them. So no, there is no itching caused by cannabis. Now this said, in chronic pain, you should consider that opioids are not really good for chronic pain anyway. There is no evidence, actually no good clinical evidence that they are useful in chronic pain. I know that they're used a lot, but that doesn't mean they're used for good reason. They're not used for good reason because actually when clinical trials have been done to study the long-term effects of opioids in chronic pain, no evidence has been found that they are actually better than placebo. When people use them is for a mixture of things. They're very effective in acute pain. So if you have an acute, say, attack of back pain, you take Percocet, you're going to feel great or fairly good in a couple of maybe in an hour and a half, and you think that is you can keep doing it, but you can't, because after a while the effect fades away, and you are stuck with your dependence and addiction on the opioid. So be careful when opioids and chronic pain don't mix well at all.
And then,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we have a few other questions about CBD and does it function in the absence of THC?
Yeah, I see CBD wasn't mentioned at all. Someone is unhappy about that. I got to say that I was hoping to address it in the question, because I think CBD is one of the most hyped things that there is right now. It's hyped to a point that is really annoying to me. There is no evidence whatsoever that CBD is effective on pain, period. I'm telling you, there is no very little animal evidence, very little, if no clinical evidence. And for some reason, you can see CBD everywhere. And for the pain in your muscle, for the pain in all this and the pain of that. Okay, I'm not gonna tell people if you want to use CBD, you shouldn't. No, of course, if you want to use CBD, use it. It's your decision. But know one thing. First, actually two things. The first is that it's not going to alleviate your pain. The second is that if you are on some other medication, which many of us are, one thing that CBD does, and does pretty well, it has effects on your liver. It is destroyed by the liver. The liver metabolizes it, which means that it transforms it chemically so that you can actually eliminate it more easily. And because of this, the liver, if you take in CBD, the liver gets busy metabolizing, destroying CBD, and cannot destroy other chemicals that you're taking, other drugs that you're taking. If they're both metabolized in the liver, which means that if you cannot destroy it, the levels will increase and you could risk an overdose. So you need to be careful with CBD. One form of CBD that I think is acceptable is locally applied, topically applied CBD. I think that is different because it won't really get into your system too much. And there is actually fairly decent evidence, not really strong, but some evidence that is anti-inflammatory when applied as a cream or as a gel or as an ointment, for example, on your joints. There is some evidence of that. So that is a safer use, which I do not necessarily recommend, but if you are interested in doing it, at least it's relatively safe. Otherwise, taking CBD is, as I said, potentially problematic on your liver. One last point on CBD. A lot of people think that they can buy CBD online, and then they can treat themselves in CBD. So, okay, CBD is good for pain. I'm going to take this tablet of CBD that I bought at Albertsons, or I bought it on Amazon. All right. So, in every animal study that I've seen, whenever there was an effect of CBD, for example, on anxiety, there is some effect of CBD in animals, was always obtained at very, 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 very high doses of CBD. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of milligrams. For example, studies out of Brazil where pharmacologists have spent a lot of time on the anti-anxiety properties of CBD. Studies in Brazil have shown that, yeah, CBD can reduce anxiety. That's called an anxiolytic effect, can reduce anxiety, particularly social anxiety. So the type of anxiety that you feel, for example, you have to give a public speech, and you see all these people, you get all excited about it. That CBD works apparently for that. There are a few studies, and they're not completely well controlled, but there is indications that it may work. However, you need to use 600 milligrams of CBD in one sitting. 600 milligrams of CBD, it's a lot of CBD. It has to be metabolized by your liver, don't forget that. And all that stuff has to go down the tubes, so to speak, through the liver. So again, be careful with that.
Is there a specific type of THC, I mean, whether it's sativa or the form, if it's an edible or smoking, that is recommended for pain?
No, let me rephrase this very, very important question. And, the reason why I wanted to have this long Q&A session is because really that's where these are type of really nitty-gritty, quote unquote, but really important questions are asked and need to be answered. So if I am in pain, let's say if I have back pain or I have some other forms of chronic pain and I want to try cannabis, what do I do? So what I do is, first of all, I go to a place where I can trust that what I buy is what they say I buy. And so the state of California has pretty strict regulations about cannabis products. So if you go to a dispensary, you will pay an arm and a leg, but you will buy something that is what is listed on the box. This said, and that's a very important thing, I really think it's a very important thing to remember. This said, the question is then how much of it and what kind of quote unquote formulation. So what type? Should I inhale it? Should I smoke it? Should I eat it? Should I don't know, do something else with it? Well, the options are really smoking, inhaling, and eating it, as far as pain is concerned. So the answer to that is it depends. It depends on who you are. It depends on what type of pain are you seeking to reduce. Say, for example, let me give you one example. Let's say that you have pain that doesn't make you sleep at night. Then what I would recommend is to use an ingestible, oral for an edible form of THC. And you can find them, in dispensaries. They have brownies, they have chocolate, they have teas. They all have the same pretty much pharmacokinetics, which means that they are absorbed with a certain rate, with a certain speed, but they are absorbed typically slowly. So what you want to do is that you want to have a fatty meal at night. You want to have some fat at night. I don't know, maybe a steak or something like that. Something that contains some fat, because that helps the absorption. You want to take your cannabis orally, and the effect will appear in anything from 30 minutes to 2 hours. There is a pretty broad window. So that if you do it at night is okay, because then you're not at risk of doing anything that could harm you, and it will dull you into sleep. You will go to sleep more easily. And some folks think it works for pain that way. In terms of dosing, when it really depends again on what kind of pain you have. My recommendation there is, and this may seem like a wishy-washy recommendation, but I really believe that is the most scientifically based recommendation. My recommendation is to start with a very low dose and increase slowly until you find a place where it works for you. So all I'm saying is very unsatisfactory, I know. But I started my talk by telling you that unfortunately we cannot answer all these questions because we don't have the type of clinical information that we need to answer these questions. So all I can tell you is what makes sense based on the pharmacology of the plant. So again, find a formulation that works for you. Smoking, probably not. I say probably inhalation or an oral form, an edible. Start slow, start low, and go up slowly, and stop when you achieve what you desire. If whatever level of analgesia or pain killing you desire to achieve. It may not work, and in which case, all right, you tried, but you could try something else in the same line. For example, you can go from an edible to an inhalation form, like a vaping. Inhalation is vaping basically, and the vaping has the advantage that when one vapes, one gets immediately an effect, right? And doesn't have to wait until the absorption has happened. The risk with vaping is that we don't really know very much about what's in the vaping itself, not just the THC, the other stuff that these vendors put, because these are not drugs, they're not controlled. So they're not controlled that well. So if in the vaping there is something that doesn't agree with you, makes you cough or whatever, then you have a problem. You see what I'm saying? So all this, I realize, is not necessarily what you would like me to say, but that's what we know right now.
Thank you again for answering our questions. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for the other questions that are listed. We hope that everyone has enjoyed, learning more about marijuana, cannabinoids, and we hope to have you on again, Dr. Piomelli.
With great pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening now.
All right. Well, before we leave, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today at our Integrative Insider Live community lecture. Upon ending the webinar, a pop-up window will have a valuable survey on this evening's event. Please help us improve our community offerings by letting us know what you think. We will also be emailing 5 key takeaways and a copy of Dr. Piomelli's presentation to the email address provided at registration. In 2022, we'll be hosting Integrative Insider Live on a quarterly basis, and we'll have Dr. Shalini Shah from UCI Pain Management on Thursday, March 17th. She is the Vice Chair and Associate Clinical Professor of Anesthesiology at the UCI School of Medicine, and she'll be presenting exciting breakthrough innovations in pain management. For more information and how to register for our events, please visit our website at ssihi.uci.edu. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.